previous videos, we talked about different levels of open-ended lab. There are level 0 to level 5. Different levels have different degree of openness in terms of the amount of information being disclosed in the lab manual. Because of this, the learning tasks by the students differ slightly between different levels. The highest levels of open-ended lab, it will be level 5, where the students have to construct everything from the scratch, starting from designing the experimental team until formulating the theories. This represents the extreme conditions of the open-ended lab, and it is normally applied for the research project dealing with laboratories. Now let us deal with the misconceptions of open-ended lab. The first misconception is that OEL is easier to conduct as less materials are provided in the lab manual. We can discuss about this misconception in two parts. First, whether OEL is easier to conduct. Second, is it really less materials are to be provided? First, you need to know when you are using the open-ended lab, you will need to properly design the lab, not simply the manuals only. The lab manual will have to be in line with the intended OEL level. Therefore, it should be designed in accordance to the adequate OEL level. However, we have established previously the definitions of OEL level is not based on the content given in the lab manual. More appropriately, we are referring to the learning tasks that the students have to deal with throughout the learning process. What is available in the lab manual, it is just a part of the OEL. Because of this, you will have to regularly review the effectiveness of the OEL, not only from the teaching material side. You will also need to look into the delivery and teaching and learning activities. How does the lecturer or lab instructor facilitate or supervise the open-ended lab? The way it is conducted is different from the traditional mode, which is more teacher-centered. Now, when come to the open-ended lab, students are given opportunity to explore and to learn from the mistakes. Instead of direct guidance given to the students, it is more towards supervisions with minimum intervention, assisting the students to go through the entire learning process. The emphasis here is not the content that the student learn. The emphasis is how to facilitate the learning process. And this made the open-ended lab very different from the traditional mode. Now coming back to the question, is it easy to conduct? Personally, I feel it is not as easy as most lecturers think, especially at the transition period, changing the mindset from the traditional lab method into the open-ended lab. The lecturer will have to find their own ways to facilitate the learning. There are some techniques that are required while doing the facilitations in order to make the learning process effective to the students. The effectiveness of OEL is something quite challenging to achieve. This is especially when the lecturer have limited knowledge about open-ended lab and the students are not exposed to the culture of open-ended lab. You will need the cooperation of both parties to make the open-ended lab successful. Now it's about the materials. Although it appears to have less materials available in the lab manual, it seems that it is easier. This is not true because you will need to prepare a series of supplementary materials so that they are easily accessible and available to the students. This may include the equipment manuals, catalog, standard operating procedures and others. Sometimes references may also be provided to the students so that they prepare themselves before entering the lab. And normally this is the part that being ignored or not known by the lecturer. Not only that, many lecturers have difficulties to ensure the students prepare before entering the lab. Instead of asking the students to prepare, not knowing what they need to prepare, a little guidance or supervision may be required. You will need to make sure the students know what they need to do for the preparations. This will require the wisdom of the lecturer to facilitate the entire process. And because of this, compared to the traditional method, the lecturer will have to spend more time supervising the students than what is required for the traditional method. The students' learning time for the open-ended lab should theoretically be longer than the traditional method, and the time committed by the lecturer will always be longer than the contact hours for the lab work. Preparation job will have to be done with the students before the lab as well. Next, the lab manual without methodology and discussions is OEL. This is not entirely true, because OEL is not entirely defined by the content in the lab manual. What is more important is the facilitations to the students through the learning process. For external parties to evaluate whether you are doing OEL, of course they are looking at the lab manual. This is something objective. However, as a lecturer yourself, you know that even though the lab manual can look like OEL, eventually, if you really review the actual learning process experienced through by the students, it is not OEL. Something must be wrong, and you will have to look into it, because the teaching methods will be very much different from the traditional. It should be more towards the facilitations to the students. Next misconception: OEL does not require supervision. This is also not true. We mentioned already, for the lecturer conducting the OEL, by right, he or she will spend more time on that OEL as compared to the traditional lab. There will still be supervisions, just that it is not hand-in-hand guidance. Or more specifically, the emphasis now is not the delivery of the knowledge, transferring the informations from the lecturers to the students. Now the emphasis here is to facilitate the students to learn through the laboratory. There will still be guidance to the students, such as what kind of information shall be required, where you can get those informations, how you can formulate the problems, how can you develop the procedures, how do you identify the parameters, how do you validate the results, how do you come up with the conclusions. The guidance are in terms of the procedures of conducting or designing an experiment, not the procedures of the experiment. You will need to allow the students to experience mistakes so that they can learn from it. There might be a process of trying and errors until the students find the right answers and right ways to do the experiment. All this requires supervision. So it is definitely not true that OEL doesn't require supervision. In fact, a proper OEL will require lecturers or lab instructors who are well trained to conduct the open-ended lab. Next misconception: the students are rated for their proficiency in conducting the lab work only. This can be half true. When it comes to the assessment or grading, it will be more or less similar to the traditional method. We will look into two major aspects. First is about the practical work. Second is about the theoretical part. There shall be evaluations while students conducting the relevant lab. As you know that students are given responsibility to prepare for the lab. Now you will have to work out a system to incorporate the grading for the practical side. Let's say now if the students are not preparing well for the open-ended lab and they require a lot of guidance, which ultimately transform the open-ended lab into the traditional method. Theoretically, students should not have any marks for the practical side. And this practical side does not only cover the lab work. It may also cover the ability of the students to effectively use the resources available and ability of solving the problems and coordinating the works among the group members. This will require the lecturer or lab instructor to have close monitoring on the students, how they operate the lab, as well as how they manage their group members. The second part, it will be the theoretical part. Normally there will be a report submitted after the lab work. You may also observe the reports coming from the students. If you observe that different groups are giving similar reports, this gives you an idea that the relevant lab most likely is not open-ended lab. You may not know there could be some other factors causing the lab or transforming the lab into the traditional methods. The problem could be due to the teaching and learning activities as conducted by the lecturer, or some other problems, including the students' mindset regarding the relevant labs. One of a good indicator of open-ended lab is to see different group of students have different ways to solve the problems. The procedures differ slightly, and because of that, the results and the finding may differ accordingly. Now, the relevant laboratory works, you should treat it as a tool for the teaching and learning activities in order to prevent the students referring to each other, literally copy everything from their seniors. The lab instructor or the lecturer should have different scenarios in hand, which can be used differently among different group of students. And those different scenarios may alter slightly the problems or procedures, as well as the results and findings as acquired from the similar set of experiment. Through this, you will ensure the students have relevant exposures of the experiment, which at the same time they develop the theoretical parts of the experiment, knowing how to apply the theories and principles under different circumstances. Next misconception. In OEL, instructors are only required to assess the group performance. This is also not entirely true. First, let us talk about the role of the instructors. The instructor will have to facilitate the learning, assess the students' performance, and also evaluate the facilitation methods for OEL. Now, it is nearly compulsory for engineering program to have open-ended lab. But what we've seen among the universities, many on paper seems to be open-ended lab, but in reality, the learning experience by the students is not really OEL. The students do not get the benefit of having this OEL. That's why we will need to review and evaluate the OEL facilitation method, whether it truly reflects the actual situations and whether it meets the original purpose of doing this OEL. On top of that, the instructor will have to ensure every group member learns from OEL and meet the course outcome. Probably this will be the most challenging part. Because doing lab is quite time consuming, normally we group the students in the size of 3 to 5 members in conducting one lab. But most of the lecturers assess the students by the groups. The entire group will end up to have the same grade, knowing that there could be some students offering very little contributions or providing no inputs to the lab works. Only those fully participate the entire learning process will learn and meet the course outcome. However, when come to the result, it is as if everyone fulfilled the course outcome as long as he or she remains in the group and somebody will do on behalf of him or her. There are limitations when you are conducting OEL in groups. This is something that we can think about. However, if we really need to monitor the groups member by member, the assessment becomes too extensive. It ends up to be most of the time spent on the assessment, which may compromise the learning quality and hands-on experience by the students. Now we have to find a balance in between. So far I have no ultimate practice that can fully resolve this. And we see most of the practices, we assume that everyone in the group contributed equally in accomplishing the lab works, which is not entirely true. Maybe we could look into this in future for some workable ways to achieve this. Feel free to share some effective methods. See if we have anything to learn from you.